I want to talk about a passage in our Acts reading that is quite a contemporary meaning to us. Peter says to the leaders of the Sanhedrin, "We must obey God than any human authority." So I'd like to talk a little bit today about religious liberty. Now, disagreements about whether and how a society should respect people's religious liberty are not new. They just seem, if you've noticed, a little louder. And part of that seems to be the fact that it's an election year, and part of that is what's being pushed through legislature. But it dovetails so nicely with what's happening in our longer version. I don't know if you noticed, that's a much longer reading than our normal reading for this Sunday. Our longer reading that Natalie read to us from Acts, which gives us insight into the activities of the fledgling, the young Christian church in Jerusalem, and why the Jewish officials are so upset, and this conversation they have with one another in the Sanhedrin is essentially about religious liberty. I thought that maybe we got by a lot of this stuff, but in this election year it seems like religious liberty is back again on the front burner. We get all sorts of candidates saying all sorts of things about religious liberty. I thought that we had already sort of settled the case with birth control for women having access to birth control. What was that, a year or two ago? In 2014, the Supreme Court with the Affordable Care Act working on the Hobby Lobby thing, but I guess that wasn't settled. We're back at it again. Religious liberty isn't a thing of the founders and of our Constitution, although that is an important feature in those things. It's alive today and well for us as well. I have to admit that as I was writing this sermon, it got quite long, and then I happened upon an article in Odyssey by Dr. Matt Skinner, who's a professor at Lutheran Seminary, who was writing about religious liberty. And it was an awesome article, and probably 1/3 of the length of my original sermon. So knowing that you'd probably appreciate 1/3 of the length, I gutted a lot of what I had to say and adapted a lot, and probably more than I ever have, and that's why I'm giving a caveat. More than I have ever borrowed from anybody's material, I'm borrowing from Matt Skinner, and whatever adaptations and abbreviations I have made to his material is on me. I've changed his thoughts, but I think his insights were helpful, so I want you to know up front that in this sermon I've borrowed an awful lot. So no matter what our political leanings, as Christians, you have something at stake about when people should be following their conscience and resisting abusive laws. Even if we disagree as to what qualifies for an unjust law or an oppressive ruler, these questions apply to us. Religious liberty demands attention from anybody who claims to follow Jesus. Why is that? Because you can't say that your faith excuses you from political examinations and these realities when a central symbol of our faith is the cross, an instrument of capital punishment. The cross was a means of government-sanctioned death sentences. So at Christianity's center, count how many crosses we have going on in here. Some of the kids will take that as what they should be doing today. Count the crosses. These crosses, central to what we are about, at the center of our experience, are a blunt reminder of what we can do to each other by oppressing and victimizing each other. And it's not only Jesus that suffers, it's the early church, as we read in the book of Acts today, reminds us that they suffered over a lack of religious liberty. But there are plenty of stories throughout church history and throughout history where faithful actions run afoul of society's priority. We have some commemorations. We don't do saint days particularly, we do commemorations. So we have some commemorations. Today, for example, April 3rd, is a commemoration that celebrates three sisters, Agape, Chionia, and Irene. Three sisters executed in Thessalonica on this day in the 4th century because of their faith. Issues of religious liberty. Commemorated tomorrow, celebrated on April 4th, 1968, the Reverend Martin Luther King, whose faith fueled a ministry of prophetic critique and social action, was assassinated in Memphis. On April 9th, in the year 1945, anti-Hitler conspirator, pastor, and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged by the Nazis. And if you scratch at this very long or go on a website like the Voice of the Martyrs, there's just a flood of stories of recent times in our world, what's happening to the church globally, what's happening in the church in the Middle East particularly and in Africa, beg us to stand together as one Christian community for these ancient communities of faith for the hope of their survival. Resistance and its repercussions are familiar themes to Christianity. In fact, the whole New Testament testifies to those realities, resistance and repercussions. In fact, the entire book of Revelation is written around that historic event of resistance and the empire's repercussions. So, St. Peter today, in light of the Sanhedrin forbidding them to preach about this Jewish Messiah, refused to stop preaching by saying, we must obey God rather than any human authorities. Now, Christians aren't the only ones who have said things like that or have at stake religious liberties. Our country is a hotbed of this. If that line from Acts, we must obey God rather than human authority, sounds familiar, it should. Plenty of other people, if you're well-read, you might know some of those folks long before the Christian church. Antigone, written by Sophocles, said something similar to it. Socrates said something similar according to Plato. And 7 Jewish martyrs defied the orders of Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century before Christ, claiming divine authority to do what they were doing. A line very similar to Peter's line, and to be sure, we should note that all of them have something else in common. Their stories all end with drastic consequences. All of them, including St. Peter, die because they resolved to be true to their conscience. Obviously, things are different for us these days. We who enjoy the benefits of a mostly civil society. These ancient stories remind us that not all religiously based liberties or conflicts are the same. Not all claims of religious liberty have the same legitimacy. This week I was talking with someone, I can't remember who it was now, but we were getting all bent out of shape about the displacement of the church in the primary culture, and we got stuck on the idea that Kohl's had a spring sale for clothing rather than an Easter sale for clothing. I don't know why we got stuck on that. We thought it was about maybe religious liberties, but it's really a knee-jerk reaction to the loss of the church being central to society as we get further and further away from it. So we have to be careful about a conversation about liberties and things that simply irk us about the way things are, that aren't actually attack on our liberties. We have to be clear and honest that we aren't expressing our anger when we toss about the language of religious liberty. Now, consider how different some of the issues are. You know them, you've seen them in the headlines. For example, in a free, tolerant, and pluralistic society like ours, can county clerks who are county employees justifiably claim that they operate under God's authority and deny marriage licenses to those in same-sex marriages? Religious liberty. Should communities of faith use their houses of worship to provide sanctuary to undocumented political refugees? That happened in our community here, Simi Valley. Religious liberty. Must a Muslim flight attendant who forswears alcohol choose between serving alcohol to passengers or being unemployed? Should pacifists, like Seventh-day Adventists and all kinds of other Christian sects, be exempt from military conscription? Religious liberty. Will Sikhs be allowed special procedures when the TSA screens them and their turbans at airports? Will they be required to stow ceremonial knives that they wear on themselves, not for purposes of cutting, but as a sense of identity? Religious liberties. I think in a free society we have to be very cautious about what we're talking about when we throw around the term religious liberty too loosely. For those of us who are fortunate enough to live in places where laws and social contracts grant us wide-ranging freedoms, a couple of considerations should frame the conversations that we have. Now, I get a little nervous, and I think probably you should be a little apprehensive too, whenever a lone religious group or individual demands some sort of freedom or exemption that other groups are not willing to support. Similarly, I think there's good reason to distrust people who demand rights for one religious community while smearing all other religious communities. So first, we do our best at articulating and respecting religious liberties when multiple faith traditions work cooperatively and advocate on behalf of one another. That is, I think, a way forward. And secondly, we have to remember what's foundational about us, which is that we have in our pledge that there must be liberty and justice for all. Now, some attempts to preserve religious liberty for certain people end up denying legally protected freedoms to others. When one demands for religious liberty carry potential to oppress or disempower another individual or a group, we might reasonably suspect that tyranny is behind it, or maybe bigotry has snuck in the back door. When Jesus' followers asserted their religious liberty, really their obligation to God, in the book of Acts, they were not demanding a right to do whatever they wanted without consequences. They knew that there would be consequences. They recognized their choices and that they would have repercussions, as did Socrates and Bonhoeffer and the Maccabean martyrs. For Christians, at least, holding fast to one's conscience and religious conviction proves to be life-giving when a believer's actions and attitudes are molded to that of Jesus himself. His authentic devotion to God compelled him to act in ways that empowered other people, even though it meant forsaking for him his comfort and prerogatives. Why did he go to the cross? Not for himself, for you and for me. The kind of religious liberty then that's embodied by Jesus was not a weapon to be brandished. It's a determination to devote ourselves to the well-being of others. That's the kind of church I want to work in, that seeks the well-being of others. For the kind of America that I would like to live in, and the kind of world, at least in my opinion, that we need to become, one with a solid foundation for a better future for us all. We all, as religious people, and specifically as Christians, have a stake in the conversation about religious liberty. But let us do so with the most broad-mindedness we have, that our rights will also apply to others who are in this e pluribus unum, out of the many, one. Will it be easy? No, it will not be easy. But we must be involved in the conversation. Will we be wrong? From time to time, we will make wrong steps, and we will become reactionary and anxious and do things out of haste or even anger that we will have to apologize for, repent of, and turn around on. But sometimes we'll be right, and sometimes we will join hands across a great nation and become an example to the world of what it means to be citizens of a common humanity. I would pray that you, in your conversations, in your workplaces, in your families, could be like yeast to that conversation, which now is kind of down to sound bites in our culture. That it would take a little bit longer to ruminate on the complexities of what it means to be a religious person in our society, and that we would extend what we want to others who are in this culture and expect of them what is expected of us. May God give us courage for such a conversation in such a time as this. Amen.